I had been using this reciprocating saw to cut branches off of trees quite a lot, but in many ways it's no substitute for a chainsaw. And so I decided to buy a battery-powered electric chainsaw because an extension cord is not very practical when you're walking around trees and cutting down branches. And I picked the Dewalt because I've already got a bunch of these 60-volt batteries for tools like this, although it turns out the chainsaw battery is 1.5 times bigger than one of these. And this saw is surprisingly powerful. It is the most powerful electric chainsaw I've ever used, cordless or not. So I've been using the saw quite a lot to just cut through my burn pile, and that makes the stick shorter and really compact it, but this is where trouble started to appear. Piece of shit! So doing this type of work, I think, has a tendency to throw chains on chainsaws in general, but I think this saw is worse than average. And I think part of the problem is this bar is just very narrow. And then, at least with this saw, once the chain gets thrown, this little sprocket keeps running against the chain. And that tends to mess up the edges of the links a little bit. And then that means they don't fit in the bar anymore. And then I have to find all the ones that have got burrs on them and file that off. And that's very frustrating. And doing this sort of work, I typically could do maybe 5 minutes of it before the chain comes off. And then it takes a lot more than 5 minutes to fix the links and put the chain back on. So the easiest way to figure out where the burrs are on the chain is just to, oh gosh, look at that here. Well, that got completely messed up. I think that happened just now. Oh dear. I don't know if that's fixable. It looks like the rollers for the roller bearing came out there. Yeah, there's a little roller, so that sprocket actually has got a roller bearing on it. I don't know if I can push those back in. I'm afraid this chainsaw bar is done. What a way to review a chainsaw, eh? Fortunately, the rest of this video was going to be all talking, so the fact that I just wrecked the bar on it doesn't prevent me from finishing the video. And I should add, pulling a chainsaw bar through a loose pile of branches like that is probably not a smart thing to do, but I think this bar is particularly prone to throwing the chain because it's so narrow, which means the sides here are very straight, which means it has a hard time pulling the chain on there just from chain tension, whereas on other chainsaws like this, you have a wider bar and more curvature here and a bigger sprocket. Same thing with this chainsaw bar as well. And another thing is the pattern of holes and slot. The way it mounts on here is actually the same as it is for a lot of chainsaws, like on this one, unlike a steel, which can only take a chain bar from steel. So I had been thinking about buying a wider bar for this chainsaw anyways, because I was figuring that might help the chain throwing problem. And I guess I'll have to do that now. Those bars only cost about, I think, about 25 bucks. So it's not too bad. So now more about the rest of this chainsaw. One thing that I found very frustrating immediately is actually this little thing here, which is a lock for the trigger. It won't go unless you push this thing down. And I was using this thing just one charge's worth, and just holding this down with my thumb, I actually ended up having a numb spot in my thumb because pushing on this sharp edge for so long, just a bad idea. So I ended up making a little wooden wedge to stick in here, and that locks it down, which means I only need the trigger. This chainsaw, unlike a lot of cheap electric chainsaws, actually has a real chain brake, and that will actually break things, and it disables the motor. But this chain brake is actually kind of a redundant feature because the motor also has active braking when you let go of the trigger. So it comes to a stop pretty quick, and I'm sure if they tried, they could make this come to a stop even faster. And relating to this thing, this is where I got a lot of frustrations. So this is actually, I think it's a lefty screw. And there didn't used to be this washer in here. And the reason this is a lefty screw is so that, on the chainsaw it typically is, so that as the sprocket runs, that tends to tighten the screw in like that. But actually, making this a lefty screw turned out to be not such a smart idea, because you typically, when you use the saw, you typically start slowly and then stop it very rapidly, like this, for instance. I guess the stopping works much better if it just spun a little bit. So if I just do that sort of thing, you notice the screw has a tendency to come out as opposed to go in, because you typically start it more gently than you stop it. And so what happened is, there's no washer in here, and the screw was just tightened in against here, and eventually that screw got loose, and this washer, there really should have been a washer behind it. This has always been kind of loose. And then the chain started to come off the edge of the sprocket, and that made the chain coming off problem a lot worse. Before I discovered this, the chain was coming off constantly once that screw had gotten loose. Fortunately, I noticed this sort of thing before I lost a screw, and since then I just put a washer behind here, and that locks it to some extent, but it still works its way loose eventually. So this is a bit of a bad system right there. And I can't really tighten it down very hard, because the chain brake only has so much resistance. It doesn't need to have that much resistance, because it doesn't actually have to work against the motor, because as soon as the chain brake goes off, the motor gets turned off anyways. Now, if you're using a real chainsaw, you tend to not be without one of these. This is a chainsaw tool, and this end is for loosening and tightening the bar nuts, and you tighten those down pretty good to really lock the bar in place. And if you need to tension the chain, you loosen those two nuts, and then you put the flat screwdriver end in the screw right here, and that is for adjusting the chain tension, and afterwards you tighten that up a bit. And then this end is for taking the spark plug out, because, you know, chainsaws, they don't always run. So that is not the most user-friendly. So on this chainsaw, they have this one knob here that engages with just the one stud here. There's another end of a stud here to keep the bar roughly aligned like this. And let's just put that on without the chain. And then once you got enough tension on here, this thing ratchets so it doesn't let you over tighten the nut. And chain tensioning is done with this knob here. See, that pushes the bar out or pulls it back in. And then tighten on here again. Now the problem with this is there's only one nut that gets tightened, and that's just not tight enough to really secure the bar. You can see it wiggles, so it has the wiggle room between the two studs. And the only thing that keeps it sliding back is this tensioning thing. So this is a very wussy way of doing it. This chainsaw used to use a similar system. So it had a similar twisty thing that basically just tightened down on this stud. And for the second stud, at least it had a stud, but it was kind of hidden behind the plastic. And then this is the tensioning adjust. Although what I found is this thing would drift loose, and with this only applying so much tension, the chain bar would actually slide back a bit. So I got so frustrated by this, I took this out and then I cut the plastic away, and since there's actually a stud there, I made it so I can just use a chainsaw tool and loosen these nuts. And that means I can lock that bar down like on a real chainsaw. And then adjust the tension with this thing here. Now, I haven't actually used my gas-powered chainsaw since I bought this one, so I'm just going to swap this bar onto this chainsaw for now, because they are compatible. And it doesn't actually matter which way this bar goes on, this way or that way. What matters is that the chain is on the right way, because if it's on the wrong way, it really doesn't cut very well at all. Tension that chain a bit. And tighten this inadequately. Okay, that's on there. It is kind of loud, unfortunately. Oh, and the other thing that kind of sucks about this narrow bar is it's so narrow, the geometry of the links ended up not working on the tip, so I couldn't really do a stab cut with it. I don't know if that was intentional or not, because of course if it doesn't engage on the tip, that also minimizes the chance of kickback. But sometimes it's useful to just be able to stab the saw straight in, and with this I couldn't do it. Oh, and here's another thing I quite like about this saw. The distance between this handle and this handle is relatively large, which makes the saw much more comfortable to use because you're always pushing down on this one and pulling up on this one to push down the end of the chain. And so if that distance is a bit shorter like it is on here, that means you have to push down and pull a lot harder. So another smart thing. So yeah, cordless chainsaws, they really are kind of a game changer, and you just have to wait for somebody to make one that's really, really good. And one product that I would imagine seeing is when you see guys that take down trees in a city, they have these one-handed chainsaws because they need the other hand to hold themselves in the tree. And they're a lot smaller, and what would make sense is to make that an electric, especially if you make it so it's actually corded, so you have a battery pack on your hip and a short cord, which means the part that you're holding in your right hand becomes so much lighter, which really should make the whole thing a lot more ergonomic. It is amazing what batteries can do, but heck, people drive cars powered by batteries, so a chainsaw maybe isn't that much of a stretch. Okay, I have to revise my review a little bit. This bar and chain don't cut nearly as efficiently as this chain and this bar together. So that made me think that this chainsaw is perhaps a bit more powerful than it is, where maybe it was just that the bar and chain were relatively new. And the other thing to watch out for, and this is something that could doom this saw, is there's these very fine screens here to pull in the cooling air for the fancy high-tech brushless motor. And those very easily get filled with oily chips and such. And really, if you cut off the cooling air, you're going to doom the motor. I guess high-tech and forestry are not necessarily a good combination.
So the nice thing about an electric chainsaw is that even Rachel doesn't mind using it, which was good because I've run into some serious tendonitis with my arms and I can't be using that chainsaw for the foreseeable future. If I compromise my manliness with a battery-powered chainsaw, I might as well go one step further. The trunk ended up too rotten to use even as firewood, so I just dumped it in the bush with the tractor. And between the time that I shot this video and had it ready for uploading, AVE reviewed that very same chainsaw, and I think that video is really worth watching, so I'm linking it here.